Hello, I am Will.
And I'm Connor.
And welcome to a History of Tsarist Russia Unit 4. Sing it to me, Carne.
Never. Yep, the cheery music.
Today we are doing Unit 4, which is the Tsarist regime from 1906 to 1914.
Which is chock full of stuff.
This includes the work of the Dumas, the agrarian reforms under Peter Stolypin, the economic development in Russia to 1914, and the condition of Russia in 1914. I'm sure Connor is going to
go straight in with the Dumas
very quickly.
Right, the Duma was very, very, fundamental to these reforms that these concessions that Nicholas II made in 1905. It included the Council of Ministers, which initiated and approved all legislation. It was appointed by the Tsar. It was led by the Prime Minister, who was also appointed by the Tsar, and it was responsible only to the Tsar. So the Tsar still maintained control of it. It also had the State Council, which is sort of like the House of Lords. It debated laws and had to approve them. It was elected half by the Zemstva and half appointed by the Tsar, so he still had some level of control. And then you have the State Duma, which is a bit like the House of Commons in today's English legal practice. It debated laws and had to improve them at a lower level. It had over 500 ministers, elected every 5 years by men over 25. So it was very limited voting age, but it was still voting.
Yep. In the first Duma was dissolved relatively quickly because of radical ideas that weren't
very good for the Tsar.
Yep. And the fundamental laws meant that. Could you quickly?
Oh yes, the fundamental laws were another way in which Nicholas still maintained control over the entire Russian country, really. Right, these fundamental laws were made at the 23rd of April 1906, just after the concessions were made, and I think probably before the Duma was dissolved, or maybe just after. These confirmed that the Tsar held supreme autocratic power, the power to initiate legislation and approve laws, the right to appoint and dismiss ministers, and command of the armed forces, responsibility for foreign relations, the right to summon and dissolve the Duma, so probably before the first dissolution, power to rule by decree when the Duma was not in session, which was called Article 87. These laws would clearly undermine the powers of the promised Duma by giving the Tsar the means to completely ignore its wishes.
Exactly. But even because of that, the Tsar was able to dissolve the first two Dumas, which are largely radical. But then, the Prime Minister, Peter Stolypin, who we mentioned before, being very suppressive to the dear old peasants, he introduced an illegal, I must add, electoral law, which changes the voting to the Duma, weighting it in favour of the Tsar's supporters. The third Duma eliminates to a large extent the peasant and worker representation, so those who disapproved of it called it the Duma of lords and lackeys.
Indeed.
More cooperation was a result of this, and the third Duma lasted its full term, 1907 to 1912. In that time period, 2,500 pieces of government legislation were put forward, and the Duma approved 2,200. Now, you could say that is incredibly cooperative, but on the downside, on the downside, completely forgot what I'm talking about now. On the downside, 300. These are the best possible Duma that you could get. It's basically all the Tsar's supporters, and they're still refusing 300 of a piece of legislation in these 5 years. 5 years. Land captains were seen as old, and they're replaced with justices of the peace.
Dum dum dum.
Oh, that sounds awesome. In fact, I should say they were replaced with justices of the peace. Hi, I'm a justice of the peace. That is what happened when Justice of the Peace was first.
Just walked into a room and everything stopped.
Hey, mum, what?
I'm a Justice of the Peace, and roll music.
Bow.
I'd imagine it would get kind of annoying after a while that every time he said his job description, it was...
Yeah, okay. Health insurance was also brought in. And
1912.
These are genuinely beneficial to the country. So you could say that the reason that they did approve the majority, admittedly they approved the majority, and the reason is because they are actually quite beneficial, these laws. But some said that the Duma is a mere rubber stamp, now dominated by the Octoberists who were cooperative with the government. But if they were a rubber stamp, why would they reject some legislation?
Indeed.
Anywho,
moving on. I'm just
on.
going to talk about agrarian reforms, which are quite an important part of this time period.
Bin.
Right. Basically...
one quick thing before you go into agrarian reforms. Stolypin said that the Duma was good because it's a sounding board for the government. They know what the country is thinking because it's got at least some representation of everyone. And it's an exchange of ideas. The government was quite old-fashioned and it did need some new exchange, new ideas, new blood, new ideas, and the Duma gave that. But he also came up with...
agrarian reforms.
Knock yourself out.
As promised in 1905, redemption payments were abolished in January 1907, and peasants became able to leave their villages. Peasants could apply for permission to consolidate scattered strips of their land into, big single farm holding. More state and crown land was made available for peasant purchase, so the Tsar and the government gave up a little bit of their land so that the peasants could have a bit more. A new peasant land bank was established to fund purchases to encourage investment in new and more productive agrarian improvements. The government also subsidises the migration to and from areas in Siberia where the peasants could set up their own farms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this had successes and failures. Peasant ownership of land increased from 20% in 1905 to nearly 50% in 1915. Grain production rose annually from 56 million tonnes in 1900 to 90 million tonnes in 1914. By 1909, Russia was the world's leading cereal exporter, not Frosties. Some peasants, known as kulaks, consolidated their land, often buying out poorer peasants to create compact and more efficient and profitable peasant farms. Around 3.5 million peasants moved from overpopulated areas to Siberia, creating a major agricultural region there for dairy and cereals. Some peasants sold out and moved to towns to find work, so boosting the industrial labour supply. And those were all good points, but they also had very severe limitations and even failures. Although the Land Organisation Commission was established, the bureaucracy involved made procedures slow. By 1913, only 1.3 million out of 5 million applications had been dealt with. By 1914, only about 10% of land had been transferred from communal to private ownership. By 1914, 90% of peasants' holdings were still based on scattered strips of land. Peasants were still reluctant to change farming methods. Some landowners tried to hold on to their lands, and it proved difficult to divide up the common land without, having legal disputes between different owners. The poorer peasants lost all their land and had descended into deeper hardship, so they started, getting into massive debts. Among the land's labourers were those who were too old or too rooted to their communities to seek alternative work. Siberia proved a difficult terrain for those who relocated there, and Stolypin's reform didn't address the key issue, the redistribution of land held by the nobility, and land hunger continued.
Yeah, basically. That was a lot. That's the most you've ever said.
I know.
The main point is that the peasantry had been taxed and taxed and taxed, and they had, the industrialisation of Russia had been carried out on their backs, and Stolypin just turned around and said that we can't do this anymore because they're going to kill us all, basically. And so he sort of relaxed it on it. And this also created a class of rich...
wealthy peasants called kulaks.
Which would have a barrier of reform because they have something to lose. If you're a peasantry and you're living in a mud hut, then you've got nothing to lose by change. But if you've got a bit of money, you've got clothes, you've got possessions, you're doing well for yourself by being a private landowner. Even if it's small land, you've got something to lose, so you're more likely to reject revolution. And them being still the majority of the country, the workers, you must remember, are still a minority. It
really boosted support for the Tsar, yeah.
And it is sticking a barrier to reform. And to show this worked, Stolypin said it would take 20 years. And then, barrier to reform, new country, social change, brilliant. And to show the impact of this, Lenin, who you must know, he's coming up. He's basically the main revolutionary at this time. He was worried about this regime, and he was one of the people that was, working to get, not to get rid of Stolypin. He saw that if this works, if they did continue this scheme, then it would have worked, and it would be near impossible to do a revolution. But Nicholas, being ultra-conservative, can undermine Stolypin. ultra-conservatives in the court can undermine Stolypin due to their constant contact with the Tsar, that's people in his home. And Nicholas was then sort of twisted in his mind against Stolypin. The Prime Minister, because one of the reasons was Stolypin was the Prime Minister,
Indeed.
and so that should be the head of the government. And so they were saying, he's eroding your power. He should be the head of the government, so he's taking over. Even though Stolypin was doing the opposite, he was preserving autocracy. He was doing more than anyone else was. But in 1909 to 10, relationships became frayed between them. Nicholas would go directly to ministers instead of going through Stolypin. An example was the Navy reform, which was scrapped, the naval bill that was scrapped, showing that even Nicholas can't work with the Duma. It was basically, he said stay away from the army and the navy and the military, basically. The Duma bill to extend the Zemstvo to Poland was scrapped. This is Stolypin's. He wanted national Zemstvo, not national Zemstvo, but national reaching of Zemstvo, which over the whole of the Russian Empire. But basically it said no. It shows that Stolypin had lost the confidence of the Tsar, and in 1911 there's a very cold relationship between them. And he was assassinated while watching an opera where the Tsar was there, wasn't he? He was arguably the last truly great minister of the Tsarist regime, because after him, there was no uphill after him, after his death in 1911, did I say?
I agree.
There's no one there, and that just leaves Russia in 1914, I believe.
Right, so the state, or condition rather, of it is a bit of a state.
I'll tell you what, I'll do background very quickly. In the 1880s and to 1894, you had the League of the Three Emperors, the Kaiser, the Emperor of Austria, and the Tsar. To keep Britain and France are traditional rivals, and you want to keep France isolated after their defeat with Napoleon, as they are likely to be out for revenge on Russia, but they couldn't touch them alone. I don't know what that means either, so just ignore me. In 1894, the Emperor of Austria and the Tsar conflict over the Balkans, which led to the Franco-Russian alliance. In 1905, French loans increased stability, and etc. So basically, they were Russia was friends with Germany and Austria. But then in 1894, they fell out, and they went with the French. They had an affair with the French.
With the frogs.
So now, in 1908, Austria annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is below Austria and sort of next to Russia, where there's a clash between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Serbia looks at Russia because there are a lot of Russians in Serbia and a lot of Serbs in Russia. But they do nothing because Austria is allied to Germany, and Germany is a massive military machine at this time. This is just after the Russo-Japanese War. Russia is trying to build up their military again, and they're mobilising. But Germany know that if Russia mobilises, they get their railways built. If all of that happens, then if France, as they're an alliance with France, Russia, they can fight a two-front war. Russia on the right, France on the left, and there's a chance that even though they've got brilliant military, Germany will fall. So they come up with the Schlieffen Plan, which is in the event of a war, a war of this nature.
In the event of a war, your emergency exits are here, here, and here.
Literally, in the event of a war, go at France, who are frankly rubbish. Just blitz at them, get to Paris, done with France, and turn around and get back to Russia before they're even at the front, because they're not mobilised, they're rubbish still.
This was the Germans' plan, by the way.
It's the Germans' plan, yeah. But the longer the Germans wait, the more Russian railways are built, and the less likely this plan is to work. Some say that by 1915 the Russian railways would be complete. Therefore, the role of the Tsar is crucial. The moment he announces that the Russian army is mobilising,
Germany's in big trouble.
And in 1914...
I will carry on with that. The condition or state of Russia in 1914. It's difficult to reach a judgment about the condition of that particular time, because the outbreak of war that year brought a wave of patriotism that masked the tensions.
Less words, Connor. Just sum up.
Tensions lying beneath the surface. Right, politics, positive, Duma had been established, Third Duma worked with the Stolypin to pass agrarian and social reforms. There's no significant opposition in 1914 because of the repression by the Ukraina.
Peasants had been crushed by 1906.
Yeah, the radical leaders like Lenin had been exiled in Switzerland and so on, and the regime was generally politically stable. The negatives about politics, Tsar addition to fundamental laws sort of annoyed the liberals, little cooperation from the Dumas. Disputes persisted despite electoral management, so there was a bit of a bias in the legal system. Radical opposition from the SDs and SRs, social revolutionaries, survived, although, like Stolypin's assassination in 1911 and the wide circulation of their newspapers among working class, the opposition was only held at bay by repression, by Stolypin's necktie. The Tsar was detached from his people, and he was very conservative. Reactionary ministers, conservatives, ignored even average demands. And the support base for the regime was very, very narrow. It was running out supporters.
Yep. Even with an Octoberist majority in the chamber as well, there were still clashes with the ministers in the Duma, as shown by the Naval Bill in 1909, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. With economy, which Connor is, I'm sure, about to sum up very quickly, I'm just going to say that in 1909 the economy was booming again. There was a 7% annual growth. After 1906, health insurance schemes were introduced for the workers, which was a massive increase. Trade unions representation was tolerated, possibly showing stabilising. But in the lead up to 1914, unrest started to grow again. An example is in 1912, I'm sure you can back me up with this. In 1912, there was a strike in the Lena goldfields, probably the biggest one, the quote that you should all remember, by the miners, ending in bloodshed and unrest nationally. That kind of triggered things off again in 1912. But up until then, it was relatively dormant. And in July 1914, over 1 million are on strike in the major cities, and St. Petersburg had a general strike. Troops were brought in, but there was no serious clash.
Okay, moving on.
Because... ... And Connor's going to have a little side note before I say because.
The economic position of Russia. Positive and economic growth averaged 8.5%, but did vary. Russia was the world's fifth largest industrial power. Growth was more firmly based on internal rather than foreign investment. Stolypin introduces agrarian reforms. There was good harvests. Negatives, Russia was growing more slowly than other countries. There was still considerable reliance on overseas investments from France. Only around 10% of Russian land was being used by peasants effectively. Good harvest disguised the backwards farming methods. And socially...
just very quickly, troops were brought in, as I was saying, about unrest, serious unrest, strikes, etc. in July 1914. But in July 1914, the World War I begins. That is serious, that's what happens. Opposition to Tsardom, very quickly, the last thing that we're going to do, opposition. Revolutionary groups, they're still against it. The SRs, the populists, trying to educate the peasantry or increase their political consciousness. There's lots of terrorism under Chernoff. 1907, they're responsible for 2,000 deaths of Tsarist officials. The Bolsheviks, part of the Social Democrat Party, the party split in 1903, as I said, and the seven-man Central Committee is now governing the party, but the AQA, the secret police, have infiltrated revolutionary groups, and I would say rather successfully.
Yes.
In 1908, one of the SR leaders was a double agent who was later executed by the SRs, and in 1914, 3 of the 7 leading Bolsheviks were police agents. Opposition were therefore limited due to a limited threat due to the influence of the AQA. So I would say of everything, the radical opposition and revolutionary groups are one of the lowest things on their list. Lenin found this period of 1904 to 14 difficult. He'd been in exile since 1900. The Mensheviks had more supporters, even though the Bolsheviks meant majority. Lenin lost control of the Iskra in 1904, meaning the Bolsheviks were made even more a minority. There are majority of problems were down to Lenin and his personality more than anything else, which it will come on to more as the war goes on. An example was with Bogdanov, a little story there, which I'm sure you will touch off. 1906-7, some Bolsheviks tried to get back with the Mensheviks. Lenin couldn't do anything because he's in exile. 1910, a revolt criticising some of Lenin's ideas, like how he was being unreasonably hostile towards the Mensheviks. And 1912, the Russian Social Democrat Party conference held in Prague, with the majority being the Bolsheviks. In fact, 2 weren't Bolsheviks. They decided that the Bolsheviks were a dissent party. So in 1912 they formally split after kind of splitting in 1903. Industrialisation meant there was a rise in the number of workers, and in 1912 industrial unrest begins to kick off. Lena Goldfood as well. Very quick statistics. 1905. 8,400 members, roughly the same for Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and Jewish Bond, who were kicked out in 1903 from the party. 1906, 13,000 Bolshevik members and 18,000 Menshevik members. After 1907, there was an increase in the numbers. 83,000 were in Marxist Party, 45,000 Bolsheviks, 38,000 Mensheviks. Then the police cracked down in 1910, and there was 10,000 official members for all the Marxist parties by 1911-12. And workers seem to look more towards trade unions. And very, very quickly, my last point is by 1914, all major trade unions in Russia come under Bolshevik influence, even if they weren't official members, including the most important, the Metal Workers Union in St. Petersburg, I think.
Probably.
This could have been due to the Bolshevik newspaper, created in 1912, which sold 40,000 copies a day in 1914. However, the Bolsheviks couldn't translate this into power because their leaders were in exile and the other ones were police agents.
Indeed.
Is that everything?
Last thing, very last thing, struggling towards the finish
Run over
line.
20 minutes?
Social. An 85% increase in primary school provision from 1905 to 1914, 40% literacy rate, welfare reforms, expansion of professions, doctors, lawyers and teachers, trade unions were legalised, as I've already said, agrarian reforms created a wealthy kulak class, there was a massive public support for the Romanov dynasty, which is the Tsarist dynasty from 1913 to 1914, and the negative side of this, only 55% of children were in full-time education, there were 60% illiteracy rate. There were appalling living/working conditions in industrial towns. There were too few doctors and teachers in rural areas. Strikes escalated in 1912, the Lena Goldfield strike. General strike at St. Petersburg. Unions did not help the majority in rural areas. Advances were slow, and for every peasant that grew richer, another became poorer. Patriotic fervour was more for Russia than the Tsarist autocracy. There was widespread disapproval of the influence of Rasputin, which we'll come on to later, over Nicholas and Alexandra. Rasputin drunkenness and womanising raised passions against the mad monk.
Right, and that is it, I believe, for this unit. So thank you. Join us next time for Unit 5, I believe.
Indeed.
Thank you.
See you
Goodbye.
later.